My name is Liz Tomsich, and my co-presenter is Chris Collins. And our presentation today will regard the characteristics and experiences of LGBTQ firearm owners. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer LGBTQ people represent a unique group of firearm owners that little is known about. So while limited prior work provides some information on ownership, motivations to acquire, and firearm behaviors among this population, to our knowledge, additional questions on how culturally specific factors relate to acquisition and firearm behaviors remain unexplored. Yet, LGBTQ people experience a unique constellation of risks, such as disproportionate victimization by violence and hate crime, structural violence, and suicidality, which may relate to ownership, motivations to acquire, and firearm behaviors. So prior research suggests that these owners feel their sexuality, gender identity, and gender expression increases their risk for targeted violence. And given that the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting explicitly targeted members of this community, and that more than 400 bills meant to restrict the rights of LGBTQ people were introduced in 2023 alone, indicates this fear is not unwarranted. Likewise, sexual minorities experience almost 3 times the risk of suicide attempts in their lifetime. So while suicidality has been associated with ownership, this link has not been explored among LGBTQ people. So today we're going to briefly summarize what's known about ownership among this population before describing in greater detail the aims of our funded project, as well as the questions we hope to answer and how we intend to answer these questions, and talk a little bit about preliminary data. So ownership studies using national data and data from Texas and California indicate lower rates of household and personal ownership among LGBTQ people relative to heterosexual, cisgender people, or the general population. So factors associated with ownership in a California sample included male gender, older age, non-Latinx, white race ethnicity, military veteran status, and a preference for the Republican Party. So this last item may in part drive the lower rates of ownership among LGBTQ folks who tend to overwhelmingly affiliate with the Democratic Party or have no preference. And in that same sample, only 10% of LGBTQ respondents identified as Republicans. Self-protection against other people constitutes the primary driver of ownership among LGBTQ firearm owners, and contextually this makes sense when you consider that between 2017 and 2019, LGBTQ people experienced 6.6 violent hate crime victimizations per 1,000 people compared to 0.8 victimizations per 1,000 for non-LGBTQ people. In general, LGBTQ people are disproportionately likely to be victims of violent crime. Likewise, hate crimes motivated by sexual orientation have been found to be more injurious compared to other hate crimes. So in a California sample, higher percentages of LGBTQ than general population owners reported holding concealed and carry weapon permits and carrying in the past 30 days. A separate study using data from California and Texas found no significant differences in sexual orientation in the odds of storing firearms loaded and locked or unloaded, and locked versus storing firearms unloaded. So the primary reasons for LGBTQ firearm ownership coupled with firearm carrying behaviors are congruent with what we shared a few moments ago about related to how LGBTQ firearm owners feel their sexuality, gender identity, and gender expression increases their risk for targeted violence. So our proposed study aims to contribute to the literature by characterizing the population of LGBTQ firearm owners and non-owners and exploring factors related to ownership, including those previously unexamined, such as the experiences and consequences of marginalization. Our first aim is to characterize this LGBTQ firearm owners with respect to factors such as age of acquisition, reasons for ownership, method of acquisition, number and type of firearms owned, storage behaviors, and plans to acquire a firearm in the next year. Our second aim is to identify demographic factors related to ownership among LGBTQ people, such as age, gender, education level, marital relationship status, racial, ethnic identity, military background, and rurality. And our third aim is to explore how LGBTQ firearm owners differ from non-owners in relation to safety and threat concerns, such as threat sensitivity, intolerance of uncertainty, risk of firearm-related violence, unique sexuality and gender identity-related stressors, victimization, and suicidal ideation. So our study utilizes survey data obtained via Ipsos of 2 distinct US-based samples. And we had requested a minimum of 400 owners and 400 non-owners within the LGBTQ community. Importantly, they weight their samples using the random iterative method to adjust distributions of the sample data collected to match known population demographic distributions. To our knowledge, this will constitute one of the largest nationwide samples of LGBTQ owners to date. The survey design methodology and measures used in this study are consistent with and informed by extant research on firearm ownership and ownership among marginalized groups. And the questionnaire comprises 5 domains. So demographics, ownership, acquisition, types of firearms, firearm behaviors, motivations to own, and future acquisition plans, perceived risk of firearm violence, and experiences with victimization, including hate crimes, discrimination, and other sexuality, gender identity related stressors, and suicidality. Our analytic approach for aim 1 is we will use frequencies and descriptive statistics to describe owner characteristics. For aim 2, we will use binary logistic regression to identify demographic variables associated with ownership among LGBTQ people. And for aim 3, we will use, again, binary logistic regression to explore differences in intolerance of uncertainty, everyday discrimination, threat sensitivity, neighborhood safety, and crime and victimization experiences between LGBTQ firearm owners and non-owners. Additionally, we'll use a series of chi-squared analyses to determine differences in lifetime and current suicidal ideation between owners and non-owners. And now I will turn it over to my co-presenter. So bear with us as we transition.
I'm trying to do it seamlessly for you.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to those of us just joining us. Excuse me, I'm using 2 screens and I'm trying to do so effortlessly for you, so hopefully that will work out well. We are very fortunate to have any results to share with you today. As you can see, we only recently closed our survey and data collection. We fielded our survey via Qualtrics from May 3rd until May 15th, so just about a week ago. We've received a total of 896 total responses that represent 49 states and the District of Columbia. 501 of those respondents were either current or former gun owners, while 395 were non-owners with no history of ownership. So among our white respondents, 41.5% are current or former firearm owners, and among Black respondents, 9.3% are current or former firearm owners. All of this is and should be taken with a bit of a grain of salt as well, simply because we, again, these are very preliminary findings and haven't been fully cleaned and analyzed. So do take all of that with a bit of a grain of salt. So our sample is majority Black or white. Specifically, 73% of respondents were white. 84.1% of those were non-Hispanic, and 11.3% are Hispanic. 15.7% of our sample identify as Black or African American, with 85.8% of those identifying as non-Hispanic, and 14.9% identifying as Hispanic. The sample is 46.5% cisgender female, with 36.9% identifying as cisgender male, and 46.5% of the sample identified as bisexual, with 40.2% identifying as gay and 17.5% identifying as lesbian. 53.8% of respondents grew up in households with firearms present, and this is approximately consistent with other research within the general population. One study using a representative sample of respondents living in 5 US states found that 43% of participants grew up in a household with firearms. And regarding purchasing behaviors or patterns, 41.2% of owners reported having purchased a firearm since March 2020, with 55.6% of those purchases being the respondent's first firearm, consistent again with research from the National Firearm Survey, indicating that new firearm owners who purchased during the pandemic tended to be more diverse and depart from the demographics of the general population of owners. Regarding anti-LGBTQ violence, 37.3% of respondents reported considering purchasing a firearm due to either direct or indirect anti-LGBTQ violence, and of those, 52.5% did actually purchase a firearm. 49.7% reported plans to acquire a firearm in the next 12 months. 51.9% of current or former firearm owners indicated personal safety or protection at home as their most important reason for ownership, followed by 24.2% who reported their primary reason as being for personal safety and protection outside of their home. This is consistent with data from California, which found that high proportions of LGBT owners cite protection as their primary reason for owning handguns. 72% versus 57% in the general population, and long guns as well, 55% versus 18% in the general population. So of those current or former firearm owners who responded in our sample, 34.9% reported having carried a loaded firearm outside of their home within the past 30 days. And of those, 76% indicated that this was for the purpose of self-protection. This is again consistent with data out of California, which found that 29% of LGBTQ owners reported carrying a loaded handgun in the prior 30 days, relative to 17% in the general population statewide. Regarding suicidality, 14.6% of current or former owners reported having experienced thoughts of suicide in the past, compared to 36.2% of non-owners. This departs from expectations to some degree. However, it does align with research indicating that association between ownership and heightened risk of suicide is not explained by disproportionate rates of suicidal ideation. Regarding safe storage or storage in general, 29.7% of current or former firearm owners reported that they almost always or always store their firearms unloaded, compared to 20.2% who reported never or rarely storing their firearms unloaded. This is somewhat lower than observed in the general population, according to one systematic review, which found that somewhere between 29 and 37% of owners stored their firearms loaded. Further, 30.4% indicated that they almost always or always store their firearms with a locking device, compared to 21.1% who reported never or rarely using a locking device to store their firearm. Should our findings indicate that LGBTQ plus owners are primarily motivated by self-protection and identify associations between ownership and sexuality or gender identity stressors, efforts to prevent firearm injury among the LGBTQ plus population, and specifically firearm owners, will likely need to address self-protection as a primary driver of ownership, in concert and combination with broader strategies, of course, to address social and structural determinants of disparities and violence risk. Moreover, questions on willingness to use safe storage or store firearms or firing pins away from home to prevent a suicide attempt by the respondent or anyone else will shed some light on receptiveness to interventions among LGBTQ plus firearm owners. Our next steps, of course, are to finish cleaning and coding this data for more thoughtful analyses and begin to disseminate these findings at hopefully the upcoming National Firearms Conference, as well as through a series of journal articles as well. And here is our information if you would like to follow up or have additional questions for us. I'm going to turn the screen off so I can see your questions.